So my take on that final scene with Darius, I'm just gonna say and safely assume that it was a regular Judge Judy, and that moment that he had with his friends was in fact real, and I think Darius wanted that as well. I've watched this finale like twice and I came to the same conclusion. I feel as though everything and everyone that he came across was pointing him in that direction of not being in the tank and just being in the present moment. In some way, despite the uncertainty and quite ambiguous conclusion, I am very happy that it ended off in that way. I feel like it's not only smart but also quite in style. Atlanta has kind of always had that reputation since season 1 to always tread into the surreal or the absurd, and I think ending it with Darius and having those elements in it was wise on their part. So I honestly applaud everyone involved in this episode, or rather this entire show. I think it's only appropriate I say that because really and truly there will never be another one like it. Now in regards to this episode, again, as I said before, I watched this twice and it really wasn't until my second viewing that it started to dawn on me. I realized that despite Darius being the show's comic relief or the one to often drop the odd pearl, he is a character that is strucken by grief, so much so that he has to go to these sensory deprivation tanks once a week to really find solace in what seemingly appears to be the past. And to the acting chops of Lakeith Stanfield, I feel as though on the second viewing and with context, it really drives that point. And something that I noticed while watching was that Darius was giving everyone the same solemn yet disheartening expression on his face. For me personally, it wasn't until I saw the scene with London again that I realized that this was someone in his life that he had lost and probably blames himself for. And I say that because while she was running, she just says,
"What do you mean?
so more than likely those comments were just a mere reflection of what Darius feels towards himself. Like, London may be reckless and quite unhinged on her own, but I get the impression that for whatever happened to her, Darius pins a lot of the blame on himself for it. So in hindsight, it's almost as if much of Darius's grief has gone unnoticed for a pretty long time. In some way, when he enters this plane of existence, it's like he goes into his own purgatory, one where he's able to manifest late loved ones and finally have some kind of solace in their passing. And although this may bring him some kind of bliss, it also serves as a detriment, so much so that it's inhibiting him from being able to move on, which I feel his late brother was trying to tell him. And assuming that these manifestations are actually closer to the thought of Darius' subconscious, it's almost as if he too within himself knows that he shouldn't be doing this and he should instead live in the present moment with those he's currently around, which is why I strongly believe the last and final scene was taking place in reality. And although he was somewhat convinced that he was in the tank still, I would argue that's a pretty natural response considering just how blurred the lines of reality was for him, and so it would make sense he would have trouble discerning what's in front of him. And so for me, at that moment, he takes the role of the unreliable narrator, which I think does his job at adding further ambiguity to the very last frame of this episode. But who's to say? I think the real sad truth is we'll never get a definitive answer on what Darius saw. Donald doesn't really have the best track record at explaining his projects, and so we'll really never know. And so as a viewer and fan of this show, I'm just going with the bet that he saw Judge Judy as is. If she was thick, hey man, you could say that, to each their own. I'm not gonna stop you. But that's generally all the thoughts that I had for this episode. To be honest, I don't really have much to say for the black sushi restaurant bits, but if I were to take a stab at it, I feel as though it's poking jab at people who uphold inconsistent pro-black rhetoric while also living in contradiction to it. And I think the host was kind of highlighting that in his speech, that black people are often distrustful of one another due to certain microaggressions that only set us further and further apart from being an actual community. And so in some angle, I do understand where he's coming from, but to be fair, Alfred and Vanessa were saying the food was not all that good, and why deal with that when you have a Popeyes right there? I totally get that it's ran by an Italian man and has very little to deal with black people, but like, who would skip out on a chicken sandwich? Let's be real. And speaking of chicken sandwiches, I don't think it was totally random or even coincidental that Darius knew Alfred and the rest of the characters was feeling for Popeyes, because at the start of the episode, Darius does take notice of Alfred pointing to a Popeyes ad playing on TV, so it's not too far-fetched to think he was just being a little mindful while picking them up in the Maserati. And from a narrative standpoint, it definitely does further play into the idea he just might still be in the tank, but with the opening scene alone, I think it clears any and all confusion on that. But I digress. I don't have much more commentary for this episode. I've already expressed in more ways than one how much I love this show, so I'm not gonna go on a whole spiel on it, but I'll end the video by saying this, and I feel like you'd only be in the know if you had the captions on for this episode. At the very end, before the reveal of Judge Judy, you can hear faint sirens going off in the background. So one might suspect that these are the cops ready to take Darius into custody for the stolen Maserati. But what if on the flip side, it's actually the ambulance coming to get Darius from the sensory deprivation tank because he ultimately drowned.